So we're hearing all the time from the media about how the progressive left is causing problems for the Democratic Party. But which party is really the party with problems with extremists? Let's talk about it in today's video. Hi, I'm Mike Reiner. I'm a lifelong Democratic activist who's concerned about the direction our country is taking. I'm also a lawyer and an academic, and I'm here to help you stand up for your values against the BS from the MAGA crowd. So there's this narrative that's developing about how the Democrats are in trouble right now because of the fact that there's too much pressure from the left. And I want to kind of push back against that narrative a little bit here today. I mean, I am one who, through much of my career, has been criticized by some members of the left of being, I guess you could say, too forgiving of the moderates. My goal has always been that we need to win elections as Democrats. That being out of power and being right on the issues doesn't matter. What matters more is getting, say, 80%, 90% of what we want and actually being in power. So I've always taken the view that we should try to make a case that will bring moderates over to our side. And what's more is I think that there are certain issues that Democrats can use as wedge issues, essentially, to peel off certain Republican-leaning voters to support our side. One of those, which I think really the Democrats have not taken advantage of, for example, is in marijuana legalization. And I've done some videos on that. I'll link to that later on. But we hear all the time about the progressive left causing problems for the Democrats. And that's really not the case. I mean, let's just revisit the history of the bipartisan infrastructure bill. What originally happened is that Bernie Sanders, Pramila Jayapal, and some other progressive legislators were looking to pass a large package of legislation using the reconciliation process. That's the process that allows Democrats to pass legislation by themselves and get around the filibuster process in the Senate. If they kept all 50 Democrats on board with the legislation that they proposed, then they'd be able to pass something without a single Republican vote. That's the way, for example, that Democrats were able to pass the COVID Relief Act that was passed early on in President Biden's administration. Now, the bill that the progressives were looking for had essentially two components. One was largely focused on quality of life issues, things like childcare, education, free funding for community college, that type of thing. The other side of the bill was focused on things like infrastructure, like repairing our damaged infrastructure and investing in clean energy. Well, a group of moderates headed by the Democratic problem children, Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, went and negotiated with a group of Republicans for a bipartisan infrastructure bill. This bill, which, despite their claims to be fiscally responsible, included no funding mechanism, amounted to about $1 trillion in spending on infrastructure. Now, I'm not going to poo-poo this bill. This is a great accomplishment, and it's something that Trump kept talking about doing when he was in office, but never was able to accomplish. So you have to give Democrats and President Biden credit for getting this done. It's also worth noting that even though this bill was a bipartisan effort, most Republicans voted against it, including Republicans, by the way, who've been going back to their districts touting about the fact that they're bringing back this money to help their districts. So at any rate, progressives were basically willing to go along with this infrastructure bill as long as we also passed something through reconciliation that addressed a lot of the concerns that we had, particularly quality of life things like childcare again, and free community college, and the dependent child tax credit. Things like that have been shown to have a huge impact on poverty in the country and also could have had a major impact at helping the middle class and kind of narrowing the huge gap and inequality that we have in the country. What's more is they were proposing that it would be fully funded largely by taxes on the very wealthy, essentially trying to undo some of the Trump tax cuts or the tax giveaway to the very wealthy that happened a few years ago. Now, the concern that many progressives had, including myself, by the way, is that the moderates would take advantage of the fact that progressives support the infrastructure legislation and essentially get their votes, and then that they would decide not to support the quality of life legislation, the legislation that ultimately became the Build Back Better bill. Well, as long as the progressives were holding firm on that position, it essentially forced Joe Manchin to the bargaining table. And it was clear that he had come up with a framework for the Build Back Better bill that was something that progressives could live with, and that President Biden was quite enthusiastic about, actually. In fact, President Biden, shortly before the holidays, had talked several times with Senator Manchin and was of the impression that they were going to be able to resolve these issues and come up with a piece of legislation that everybody could support. Well, the problem came up last November. when the Democrats narrowly lost the gubernatorial election in Virginia. This was a real disappointment to Democrats and was viewed as a warning shot as to the danger that Democrats could face in the upcoming midterm election. One of the narratives that was put out there as a result of this, including by myself, I have to admit, was that part of the problem that Democrats face is that we were frustrated. We couldn't get this done. The constant back and forth over these pieces of legislation and the lack of progress on them was something that hurt us among the voters. On the one hand, it led to us not really having anything to sell to moderate voters to show them that we were fighting on their behalves and able to deliver something for them. On the other hand, it discouraged the progressives and resulted in them not really turning out at the levels that we would hope for in that kind of election. Because again, we as progressives were frustrated with the fact that this legislation wasn't getting through. Well, as a result of that then, the progressives backed down and said, okay, we'll pass this legislation as long as you promise to eventually support some version of the Build Back Better bill. Well, Joe Manchin made that deal and agreed to it, and even provided President Biden with written documents stating the fact that he would support a framework of a Build Back Better bill that the progressives could also support. Based upon these assurances, the progressives supported the infrastructure bill, which again would not have passed without their support. It's important to note that, because again, the majority of Republicans voted against it. Well, then what happened is, surprise, surprise, Joe Manchin backed out on his deal. Where Joe Manchin had pledged that he was going to support the Build Back Better bill in return for the progressive support for the infrastructure bill, he backed down. Exactly what the progressives, including myself, by the way, were concerned with from the very moments that the infrastructure bill was first proposed. So where does that leave us now? Well, there is some talk about trying to pass certain pieces of the Build Back Better bill that might be particularly popular. We'll see where that all goes. But at this point, really, there's nothing motivating Joe Manchin or Kyrsten Sinema to try to negotiate with the progressives, which, again, is exactly what I was concerned about and what other progressives were concerned about while they were withholding their support from the infrastructure bill. Now, the point of this story is that the progressives were the ones who were willing to give up what they cherished, what they were concerned about, based upon assurances from the moderates, to get what the moderates wanted. And the moderates were the ones who backed out on the deal. In other words, the progressives were the ones who were willing to put party before anything else to try to support the Democratic Party and make sure that the Democratic Party was successful. Whereas the moderates, once they got what they wanted, they were willing to throw all caution to the wind. I was reminded of this story by an article that I saw in the New York Times today talking about an agenda that's being put forward by centrist Democrats trying to counter the arguments by the right that Democrats are out of touch. As always, by the way, I'll link to this article down below. At any rate, the striking thing about this agenda is that it's all items that the progressives are pushing for. They're things like the ability to negotiate over drug prices to reduce the cost to Medicare, expanding Medicare to cover vision, dental, and hearing care, investments in the electricity grid and our infrastructure to address climate concerns, an expansion of child and adult nutrition programs. I mean, these are all things that progressives support. And what's more is that they're allegedly creating this agenda to counter the progressive agenda, which includes things like Medicare for all and allegedly defunding the police. But here's the thing. There aren't any Democrats in Congress right now pushing for those things on any kind of real basis. They may say, for example, that ideally we'd like to see Medicare for all. But they've shown by their actions that they're willing to compromise and are willing to push for any kind of expansion which will help give health care to more people, even if it doesn't involve an expansion of Medicare to everybody. So does that sound like progressives are being the problem? Now let's, of course, contrast that with the average Republican. Republicans, of course, basically are required to bow down to His Highness Trump at this point. And the cost of entry into any kind of Republican race at this point is to agree with the big lie that Donald Trump won the election, not Joe Biden. I mean, we've seen the way, for example, that Liz Cheney, one of the most conservative members of the House, the daughter of former Vice President Dick Cheney, for crying out loud, has been targeted by Republicans, including the Republican leadership in the House, for the crime of being willing to tell the truth about the fact that Donald Trump didn't win the election. I mean, it's ridiculous. And if you think that this is the only issue that shows how far out of touch Republicans are, consider the abortion issue. And this is what I've been saying all along, by the way, which is that the abortion issue is not just about abortion. It's about controlling women's bodies. And once Republicans have succeeded, as they appear to be doing, in overturning Roe v. Wade and making it so that states are able to ban abortion the way they are in Texas right now, watch out, they're coming for your birth control next. Because the goal, the actual goal of these Republicans is to make sure that American women are barefoot and pregnant and unable to work. They're essentially trying to turn back the clock to their vision of how things existed in the 1950s. And I got news for you. For many people, things weren't so great in the 1950s. Well, if you think I'm exaggerating here, just note that there was a debate among the Republican candidates for Attorney General here in my home state of Michigan. And I'll link to the article on this down below as well. In that debate, of course, all of them pledged to support Donald Trump's claim that he won the election, even though he didn't. But beyond that, they all said that they want to overturn the law Griswold v. Connecticut. That law became the basis of Roe v. Wade. But what Griswold said, and you should be aware of this, is it said that a married couple were allowed to get contraception and the government couldn't stop them from doing it. Yes, that law, now, all the Republican candidates for Attorney General here in a major state in Michigan are saying that they want to see it overturned. I mean, I don't need to go into any kind of explanation about other issues where Republicans are out of touch relative to the Democratic position and relative to the position of most Americans. But I can't imagine that there's anybody out there, except for the most extreme, who would favor getting rid of the law that makes sure that married couples can get contraception when they need it. But that, my friends, is the Republican Party today. The truth is there's no contest between which party's activists are more to the center of what Americans stand for. So much for the radical leftists in the Democratic Party pushing the party to the left. Problem in American politics is a Republican Party that has gone so far to the right now, they've lost sight of where the center is at all. Well, if you like this video, maybe you'd like to check out this other video that I did quite a while ago talking about the concerns that progressives had as to the infrastructure bill and how moderates would ultimately abandon the Build Back Better bill as a result of it. I'll see you then, and in the meantime, let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.